Welcome. Join me on a thrilling journey as I unravel 3 terrifying tales of horror that lurks within these hallowed shelves. Prepare to be captivated by eerie whispers, haunted pages, and the dreadful secrets hidden in the dusty corners. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button if you dare to be part of this bone-chilling adventure. Have fun and nightmares. I sat alone in the dimly lit library, surrounded by towering shelves of books. The air was stale, and the scent of old paper mingled with the faint smell of mildew. It was a place that felt frozen in time, a relic of a forgotten era. The librarian, Mrs. Anderson, was a stooped and frail woman in her late 60s. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes, hidden behind thick spectacles, seemed to hold a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. I had been frequenting this library for months, drawn to its hushed atmosphere and vast collection of literature. But as time passed, I began to notice something unsettling about Mrs. Anderson. There was an unease that radiated from her, an oddity that seemed to grow stronger with each visit. Her movements were jerky and abrupt, her hands trembling as she scanned books or rearranged the shelves. One rainy afternoon, as I sat engrossed in a novel, I caught sight of Mrs. Anderson in the corner of my eye. She was standing near a bookshelf, her head bowed as if deep in thought. But what caught my attention was the glint of a knife tucked into her apron pocket. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pretended to be engrossed in my book, stealing glances at her whenever I could. I began to observe Mrs. Anderson more closely, noting her behavior and interactions with the few patrons who entered the library. She was always polite, but there was an underlying tension in her voice, a certain edge that suggested something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, monitored, as if Mrs. Anderson knew I was onto her. One fateful evening, as dusk settled outside the library's windows, I found myself alone with Mrs. Anderson. The rain poured relentlessly, its rhythmic patter echoing through the empty halls. I approached the librarian's desk, feigning interest in a book on display. Mrs. Anderson glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice sharp and brittle. I smiled, trying to appear nonchalant. "No, thank you. I'm just browsing." She nodded, but her gaze never wavered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. It was then that I knew, deep in my gut, that I was in danger. As I moved through the aisles, my steps silent, I noticed a door at the back of the library. It was a door I had never seen before, hidden behind a dusty bookshelf. A thin sliver of light seeped through the crack, beckoning me forward. My curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously approached the door, peering inside. What I saw inside that hidden room would haunt me forever. It was a macabre chamber, filled with shelves upon shelves of books. But these were not ordinary books. They were bound in human skin, their titles scrawled in blood-red ink. The room reeked of decay, and in the center stood a small wooden table, littered with blood-stained knives and scraps of torn flesh. I stumbled back, horror gripping my throat. I had stumbled upon Mrs. Anderson's true obsession, her dark secret hidden within the walls of the library. She was not just a librarian, she was a killer, a collector of human skin and bone. I fled from the library, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But the image of Mrs. Anderson, her eyes filled with madness, haunted me. I knew I couldn't keep this horrifying discovery to myself. The police needed to know, the world needed to know. Evil can lurk in the most unsuspecting places, behind the mask of a meek librarian or within the pages of a book. The horrors we seek to escape from may be closer than we realize, waiting in the shadows of our everyday lives. Beware the quiet ones, for their silence may hide the most disturbing truths. I called the police and told them what I had discovered. The police arrived shortly after, their arrival accompanied by flashing lights and sirens. Mrs. Anderson was arrested, her true nature finally exposed to the world. As the truth of her crimes unraveled, the library became a place of horror. The library was always my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the pages of countless tales and escape from the monotony of everyday life. Nestled within the heart of our small town, it stood as a beacon of knowledge, its towering shelves lined with books that whispered untold stories and secrets. On that fateful day, I stepped through the library's heavy oak doors, feeling the familiar hush of the dimly lit space enveloping me. The scent of aged paper and polished wood wafted through the air, enticing me further into the depths of its labyrinthine corridors. At the front desk stood Miss Evelyn, the librarian. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up and her spectacles perched on the edge of her delicate nose. She had an air of elegance about her, and her smile was always warm and inviting. With gentle grace, she gestured for me to explore the shelves, knowing that the library held untold treasures that awaited my discovery. As I ventured deeper into the stacks, I encountered Mrs. Gallagher, a kindly woman with a penchant for mystery novels. She was a fixture of the library, spending countless hours lost in the world of whodunits. Her presence alone added an air of familiarity to the atmosphere, her soft whispers of excitement as she unraveled the latest puzzle, creating a symphony of anticipation. Adjacent to Mrs. Gallagher was Mr. Jenkins, an elderly gentleman who had dedicated his retirement years to history. He spent his days meticulously poring over the annals of time, his eyes twinkling with joy as he uncovered forgotten tales of forgotten heroes. His infectious enthusiasm breathed life into the dusty tomes that surrounded him. Then there was Emily, a young college student with a perpetual frown etched upon her face. She rarely interacted with others, her nose buried deep in textbooks and research papers. She seemed preoccupied, distant even, and her occasional sighs only added to the enigma that shrouded her presence. The library in all its grandeur was a haven for us all, where the characters and stories within the pages became our companions. We would often exchange knowing glances, acknowledging the unspoken camaraderie we shared in our shared pursuit of knowledge. However, as the days turned into weeks, a subtle unease began to settle over the library. It started with the faintest of whispers, indiscernible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At first, we dismissed them as figments of our imagination, a side effect of our collective devotion to the written word. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. They slithered through the aisles like serpents coiling around our senses, evoking a primal fear that seeped into the depths of our souls. Our conversations grew hushed, our brows furrowed in confusion and trepidation. The whispers seemed to be born of the books themselves, as if the pages held secrets too terrible to be contained within their bindings. The once familiar titles on the shelves now appeared sinister, their spines bent and cracked, as if they had weathered centuries of dark knowledge. Emily, whose melancholy had deepened in recent weeks, was particularly affected. She would sit for hours in the farthest corner of the library, surrounded by ancient tomes that towered over her frail form. Her eyes seemed haunted, as if she had glimpsed something beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. One night, as I ventured into the library after hours, unable to resist the magnetic pull of its mysteries, I stumbled upon a scene that chilled me to the bone. In the dim glow of the lamplight, I saw Emily, her eyes vacant and glassy, clutching a book to her chest. The whispers swirled around her, a vortex of darkness that seemed to feed off her despair. I reached out to her, calling her name, but she did not respond. Her grip on the book tightened, and with a sudden burst of energy, she flung it against the shelves, shattering the silence of the night. The other books trembled in response, as if they were awakening from a long slumber. Terrified, I fled the library, the echoes of Emily's anguished cries ringing in my ears. I vowed never to return, but the library's allure was too great to resist. I returned the next day, consumed by a morbid curiosity, only to find it empty and desolate. Miss Evelyn, Mrs. Gallagher, and Mr. Jenkins were nowhere to be found. The shelves, once brimming with knowledge, were now barren and devoid of life. The library had become a graveyard of forgotten stories, a monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. To this day, I am haunted by the memories of that library, by the whispers that still echo in my dreams. I search for answers, piecing together the fragments of that fateful night, desperate to understand what happened to those who were lost. As a librarian, I've always been fascinated by the world of books. The smell of old pages, the creaking of the shelves, and the hushed whispers of curious readers have always been a comforting presence to me. But that all changed one night, when I experienced a horrifying incident that shook me to my core. It was a typical Friday night shift, and the library was unusually quiet. I was sitting at my desk, reading a book, when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the stacks. I assumed it was just a curious patron browsing the shelves, so I ignored it and went back to reading. but the sound persisted, growing louder and more persistent. I decided to investigate. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed that the lights were flickering, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My heart started racing as I reached the end of the aisle, where I saw a figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat and a fedora hat, with his back turned to me. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I walked closer, and as I did, I noticed that his skin was a sickly shade of yellow, and his eyes were bloodshot and sunken. I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath. I asked him if he needed any help, but he just stood there, motionless. Suddenly, he turned around, and I saw his face for the first time. It was twisted and contorted, with a sickening grin that made my blood run cold. I tried to back away, but he lunged at me, his gnarled hands reaching for my throat. I managed to push him away and ran back to my desk, where I frantically called security. It wasn't until later that I found out the true horror of the man's identity. He was a notorious serial killer, known for preying on innocent victims in libraries across the country. He had been on the run for months, and no one knew where he was hiding. It was sheer luck that I had stumbled upon him that night, and I shudder to think what would have happened if I had been any closer. From that day on, I could never shake off the feeling of unease that lingered in the library. Every time I walked down the stacks, I felt like someone was watching me, waiting to strike. It didn't help that strange things started happening around the library too. Books would fall off the shelves for no reason, and the lights would flicker on and off. I even heard whispers in the air, as if someone was speaking to me from beyond the grave. I tried to ignore it all and carry on with my work, but it was getting harder and harder to do so. I found myself jumping at every little sound, and my nerves were constantly on edge. I even started having nightmares about the man in the fedora, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that he was still out there, waiting for me. One day, I decided to confide in my colleague, a woman named Sarah who had been working at the library for years. I told her about my experiences, and to my surprise, she nodded knowingly. It turned out that the library had a dark past, one that few people knew about. Decades ago, a group of cultists had used the library as a meeting place, performing unspeakable rituals in the dead of night. Rumor had it that they had summoned a demon from the depths of hell, and that it still lingered in the library, waiting for its next victim. I didn't know what to make of Sarah's story, but it certainly explained a lot. From that day on, I started seeing things that I couldn't explain. Shadows would move on their own, and strange symbols would appear on the walls. I even saw the ghostly figure of a woman in a long white dress, who disappeared as soon as I looked at her. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit my job and moved away from the city, hoping to leave the library's haunting memories behind. But even now, years later, I still think about that night and the horrors that lurked in the stacks. The library may seem like a peaceful place, but beneath the surface, there are dark secrets that can never be revealed. Are you prepared to embark on a haunting journey delving into the depths of nightmare memoirs? Will you dare to uncover the chilling secrets that lurk in the shadows? Join us and become a fearless seeker of all things spooky. Subscribe and like if you dare to traverse the shadowy depths with us.